You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're talking about John Carpenter's Christine. Here we go. You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez, Pete Charbonneau, co-host extraordinaire, and we have a number of esteemed returning guests. First up, we've got Michele Brittany, writer, editor, pop culture scholar, who with fellow returning guest Nick Diak, also a writer, editor, and pop culture scholar. Together they host the HP Lovecast podcast, dedicated to the works of Lovecraft. Also joining us, Josh Pruett, Emmy-winning TV writer, author, who's worked on Mystery Science Theater, Phineas and Ferb, and Last Comics on Earth. And I think it's probably fair to say, anytime any of us in this group are on a podcast, if I don't bring it up, one of them do. We're always talking John Carpenter.
Sorry, gang. Them's the rules.
That's right. And it works out because on this episode, we're talking about a specific John Carpenter movie, 1983's Christine.
Stephen King, John Carpenter, two great masters of terror, have teamed up to take you for a ride.
I knew a guy had a car like that once. He killed himself in it.
Christine, based on the best-selling novel by Stephen King, rated R. Now playing.
It's a cult classic. I think it's fair to say, but I think you guys would probably agree. You could probably argue that with most of John Carpenter's catalog.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think largely it's considered a lesser Carpenter. I don't think that's an earned classification, but it is interesting because I think when you talk to people, it doesn't necessarily sit in their, top 5 or sometimes even their top 10, I think, depending on the day. But boy, there's a lot of great stuff in this movie.
I think it's interesting how it seems to me, because it's based on the Stephen King novel, I feel like a lot of people forget that John Carpenter was even involved in this. Obviously, if you watch, there's a lot of Carpenterisms in it. But I feel like for whatever reason, because those two masters of horror are melded together in this, people forget one or the other.
And this is kind of sandwiched in that in between where Carpenter does Halloween in 78. And then you have movies like Sleepaway Camp that also come out in 83. But you don't get Nightmare on Elm Street to the next year, 1984. So there's this kind of like valley, I think, not just for horror, but also for Carpenter, that the year prior makes The Thing, that also, again, modern day beloved cult classic that's been embraced, but it wasn't embraced when it was first released.
He pointed that out in interviews, coming off The Thing, which depending on when you watch the interview with him, he's either more or less salty, I think, the farther away that it gets from when The Thing came out. But I think that certainly had because that was his first studio film, The Thing. And then when it did so poorly at the box office, he would end up going back to, doing more indie fare. So I think, him taking Christine, I think was a way for him to kind of jump into something that was I know King was writing it or it had just come out while they were doing production, but it was something I think a little more established rather than having just his imprint on it. It had the backing of being a Stephen King book. And then I think from there he went and did Starman after that, and then
Starman's after. And I think what's weird is that there's an alternate universe where Carpenter did Firestarter instead, and that was the plan following The Thing before it got released. Like that was what he was lined up to do. And so it's like there's an alternate universe where that movie happened, and Carpenter then went on to do more studio pictures. So in some ways, it's like this one ends up that it's that next branching narrative of Carpenter's career. That Christine leads us to Starman and leads us to all these other wonderful things that I don't think we would have gotten if he had done Firestarter like the plan had been at the time.
One thing that I noticed with Christine on rewatching it, because it had been several years, I do remember seeing when it first came out in the theater. After I saw the movie, I would not walk in front of an old car. And upon rewatching, it was still a creepy film. But I also noticed that Carpenter took some turns from his formula that he was kind of establishing as an auteur. One being not using his own music to start out the film. Instead, we've got pop rock and kind of contemporary music of that time or near contemporary which was very different. And it's quite a ways into the film before we actually hear Carpenter.
I know for me, this was actually the first time I've seen Christine. It was
interesting.
This past week. I had put off Christine for years. It was just an item on Carpenter's filmography. And I'll be honest, I didn't have any interest in watching it. And, I knew what it was about, a killer classic car. And, it just wasn't my thing. Even though I like retro things and pinup culture and stuff, it doesn't go into like custom culture and rockabilly culture and stuff. When we watched Christine and, sat through it, I was actually, I went in with kind of, lower expectations, and I wound up really actually enjoying Christine. I thought it was actually very accessible and very fun. Definitely a love letter to 50s culture that's, seen through lens decades later. And come on, that's all what we're here about, nostalgia and stuff like that, right? But no, I wound up really liking Christine quite a bit. It's not my favorite Carpenter, obviously, but it's definitely way notches up there.
I think accessible is a great word too, Nick. I think one of the reasons that it, I think, has the reputation that it has is that there's something about it where it has some of his hallmarks, but not all of his hallmarks. It has some of his edge, but not all of his edge. It's like that, like spooky Sunday matinee, like that sleepy matinee that you might catch on TV, and it's beautifully photographed. It looks like a Carpenter film. He's working with a different DP. This is Donald Morgan, who he would shoot Starman with. And the movie looks gorgeous. So this is coming off of his relationship with Dean Cundey, but the lighting is still a character and a presence in this movie. The movie, it's wide, it's dramatic, it's beautiful, but I would wager that most people saw it on television or on VHS, they didn't necessarily see it in the theater. But there is something about it that it's interesting, because I think its strength also ended up being its weakness because it's so accessible.
I wanted to jump on that, Josh, because you mentioned the theater, and you know me, I like context. And it kind of makes sense because in 83, you've got Return of the Jedi, Trading Spaces, Jaws 3D, National Lampoon's Vacation, Scarface, Christmas Story, War Games, Kroll, Fire and Ice, Cujo, Cycle 2, The Dead Zone. So it makes sense that it would have been overshadowed. I did see when it first came out, it immediately went to the 4th spot, and within a few weeks went to the 9th spot. Box office, for sure, overshadowed by a lot of those movies, by another Stephen King movie adaptation in The Dead Zone. The other comment that you made, Nick, that Josh, you jumped on in accessibility, I think in rewatching it this time, I've always seen it, like you said, Josh, a lesser Carpenter, maybe even a lesser horror movie, especially when you see it on the video store shelf, and it's maybe not the one you gravitate to immediately, but seeing it this time around, I was looking for other themes. I was trying to find that other level, and I was starting to see how this starts dealing with all the high school stuff, self-esteem or the lack of, young romantic relationships. The relationship with the parents, with Arnie, I thought was interesting, and even with his friend that's played by John Stockwell. But just that idea of, like, I remember having my first job and you save your money and having your parents asking you, like, what are you going to do with the money? Are you saving? And starting to kind of like find your own way, but also having those clash with your parents who might have the best of intentions, but because you have that teenage rebellion, well, I want to do the stuff that I want to do with my money. And maybe I just want to give this guy $250 to buy this old car, but I don't want you guys to second guess me. Let me be myself. Those were the themes that I had not seen before that I saw now, that I'm hoping, Nick, made it for an enjoyable experience for you, because of horror, because of Carpenter, because your love for the genre, but also because, hopefully for someone who's discovering it now like you are, you're like, oh, there's actually more here than just a killer car.
What I kept pairing the movie up to in my mind is Phantasm. Even though this movie was made 80s, it takes place in the late 70s, which is exactly when Phantasm was made. And even though Phantasm is pure atmosphere and it goes for a different tone, like in Phantasm, the parents are dead. The older brother is now, thrust into being a kind of a parent to the little kid and everything like that. But still, it's kind of I don't want to say dysfunctional family, but it's not like a normal, typical nuclear family, versus in Christine, where the mom is trying her hardest to maintain the most perfect suburban nuclear family ever. But they're both movies both have an emphasis on cars, between the Chevrolet Fury and the Himakuda, whatever.
The Hemikuda, yeah.
Yeah, it's funny, because I'm watching Christine again. I don't know car culture, but everyone's like, your car's, even when his car is fixed up, and even if you didn't know it was cursed, people are looking like that is the worst car in the universe. And I'm sitting there thinking, are they thinking that because, generation wise, you're supposed to skip a generation of cool because that car is coming from like the parents' generation. My parents aren't cool. Right. And like you take Phantasm and that's the car from the current generation. So that's what's cool. So even though both were like two completely separate horror films, I couldn't help but juxtapose the two together between Phantasm and Christine, even though they go for way different things. Maybe it's just because they both have cool cars.
I love that pairing, and I think that'd make a great double feature. But also, it's also got me thinking that in some ways this is like the dark echo and response to American Graffiti. You could go watch American Graffiti, and then you go watch this movie. The evening went darker. Richard Dreyfuss is going off to find that girl, and he's going to talk to the radio host. But this is happening across town.
With not like a 50s Thunderbird. The mystery of an old car. The things that you don't understand that are part of a different generation, an older generation. And the fact that, Stephen King's work and Carpenter is kind of celebrating this through the possession, through like the haunted object that is the car, right? Mm-hmm. That 1950s greaser feel that you see in like another movie that came out the same year was The Outsiders. It's kind of leaning into that culture, but the silhouette of the Plymouth Fury they use in this isn't like a known silhouette. It just looks like an old car. And it's not the Thunderbird, but there's something that Carpenter does with it that gives it like the Fury in its namesake. Yeah, like the blacked out windows. This is the first time I ever noticed it. It has a little bit of like a green luminescence around it. And I think I always thought it was an effects things that that wasn't caught later in the film processing or something. But it's like, oh no, like when this thing is sentient and it's driving around on a murder spree, this was thoughtful. This was thought out.
Yeah.
Just kind of following on this theme of that kind of dark material and topic. That yes, I was thinking about this as a response to American Graffiti, but I was also thinking about some of the earlier films like Duel. I think maybe James Brolin was also in a film with a car where you never see the driver. And I do kind of feel like maybe John Carpenter is kind of like looking at some of those type of films and pulling in a perspective of, okay, now we've seen
the car
one side. Oh, it was
to the car, right? Yeah,
the car.
Apparently, that's one of Del Toro's favorite movies. I guess he has a replica of that car. Apparently.
Yeah, so it's very mysterious. But now Carpenter, flips it, and we see the driver. It's Arnie. It's this fellow that was a geek and nerd before those were really popular terms. But the change is phenomenal in Arnie in the film. We all can identify with him and also feel that tension and kind of be transported back to when we were kids in high school and how we weren't accepted because, we didn't have the clothes or we wore glasses. Oh, for God's sakes, I didn't wear my glasses all through high school because I didn't want to be labeled that I was weird because I had to wear glasses, right? Yeah. So, it's a lot of those things. And I think that, going back and seeing Christine again and kind of thinking about and making all those connections now that we're able to do in retrospect, I think is just really gives more, kind of ups the value of Christine that I think got missed, in a contemporary setting when it was first out.
I'm with pretty much everyone else. And when I first saw this when I was younger, definitely not one of my favorite Carpenter films. And I was looking forward to kind of seeing it with fresh eyes and seeing what I could pick up on now being older. And there's that 50s sheen aside from the car. You got Buddy as, the antagonist in the shop class. He even has like the sideburns, like, reminding me a little bit of Travolta, like Grease, maybe a little bit longer hair. But again, you've got like these very archetype characters that I certainly could relate to growing up in the 80s. I had shop class, I had metal shop and things like that. And I was not particularly adept at any of that stuff, as my family can attest by the things that I brought home that were supposed to be household items that I think were immediately just thrown in the trash. But one of the things that I picked up on this time one was a subtle thing, and one was just kind of the idea of Christine and Arnie as cast-offs and outsiders.
Yeah, outsiders.
And how that can lead to this idea of no one can understand us, we belong together, and then showing that really dark side of like codependency and how that kind of taken it to its limit is just really not a healthy thing in the case of a horror movie. But one of the subtle things that I like that Carpenter does in this, and I haven't read the novel, so this may have already been relevant in King's work, but Christine being its own sentient personage person is not possessing Arnie. Like Arnie still has his agency, and he kind of takes this really dark turn because of he is this cast off, and he has one friend, does not see eye to eye with his parents, all these things. And I think in other films like this, you would normally have seen like the car possessing him, and so there's like that direct link. And yes, there's influence, but he's still his own person, and you still feel like they are two very separate identities that are kind of enmeshed in each other's world. I thought that was like really interesting. It really elevated my enjoyment of this movie from what it used to be.
Did you catch, watching it this time, the scene where Arnie is talking to Dennis and he's got like the full, very aggressive, possessed eyes, and he's kind of talking about like toxic love? Because you just mentioned that, like, and I was like, oh, like when you said that, I was like, that scene, I think I've never listened or heard it before. Like watching it this time, as you mature and you're in relationships, you kind of start understanding a little bit more maturity. It's like, I'd never heard that scene before, like I heard it this time.
Arnie, Lee's on your side. She cares a lot about you. She does. Yeah. Hey, don't you like this beer? I thought you liked beer. Did you hear what I just said?
Let me tell you a little something about love, Dennis. It has voracious appetite. It eats everything. Friendship, family. It kills me how much it eats. But I'll tell you something else. You feed it right, and it can be a beautiful thing, and that's what we have. You know, when someone believes in you, man, you can do anything, any fucking thing in the entire universe. And when you believe right back in that someone, then watch out, world, because nobody can stop you. Then nobody, ever.
And you feel this way about Lee?
What? Fuck no. Talking about Christine, man. No shitter ever came between me and Christine. Now you watch this.
Yeah, and I love the juxtaposition of like Arnie's first first viewing of Christine is almost kind of like a meet cute like boy girl thing where he's like driving with Dennis and he's like no go back. It's like you've seen this in, like you were saying, Michelle, in countless like John Hughes movies. It's like boy sees girl from across the room and there's like that longing look of like, oh, she's gorgeous. I have to somehow find a way to talk and meet her. And it was like really played up that way. And then obviously it goes really dark. But I never noticed that on my earlier viewings either. So,
but she's a bad girlfriend. And I think that's one of the things that actually makes it super unique. Christine doesn't possess him. She seduces him, but like she's her own entity. And I think that also feels like really cool and different and interesting. And I think one of the things that I think is always really amazing about King, kind of in any medium, he is somehow able to connect with people whether they actually read the stuff or see the movies or not. Oh yeah, the haunted car. People who have never even seen it, they know that that's what this is. Largely, they're not going to think about Brolin in the car or the cars that ate Paris, or even Duel is like, there is clearly a driver in there. So we know that's not a ghost. There's something really amazing about the reach of some of these concepts. People know what this is, even if they've never seen it. So there's clearly something that resonates in amongst all of those pieces. There's a book I wanted to throw out. There's actually a book about the Making Christine written by Lee Gambin called Hell Hath No Fury Like Her, The Making Christine. And it's excellent. And it gets into a lot of these wonderful things that we're talking about. There's a lot to unpack there about the movie. But I think I'm always kind of blown away by that there's a certain combination of elements. Carpenter is hitting all of those with this movie, but the end result is something that's a little more digestible, and it's not as flashy, but it's still really entertaining. The scares are there and the excitement is there. And by the time, Michelle, we get to the Carpenter theme that he did with Alan Howarth, like, it's awesome. There's a house remix of Christine's theme that's out there that I've been listening to for years. This thing really, when it cooks, it really cooks.
Just like when the car's on fire, that's cooking.
Yeah.
There it is.
I'm sorry, that's a cool sequence.
It's great.
And what I love about like the soundtrack is I feel like it slots in so nicely in that mid-period Carpenter, where it's got elements of Halloween, it's got elements of The Fog, and it has elements of what would come later with Halloween 3. From the atmosphere, the tone, leaning more into the synth world, it fits in so perfectly. And this is one of his better soundtracks, I would argue.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Even the music selection, where the songs almost are meant to be the voice of Christine in the lyrics, in the tone. I think that was kind of interesting to see that. Mm-hmm. Now, have any of you read the book? Michelle, you have?
What struck me with the book is that Christine was haunted. So, I mean, there was an entity within her, her body from the time that she was on the assembly line, which is what we see in the opening shots. And great shots too. Tail fin, the reflection of the people working behind her, on the little side mirror and things like that. But one of the things that you get in the book, and I think that Carpenter does a really nice job, but it's pretty subtle, is the fact that Arnie becomes kind of possessed by the spirit. The spirit possessed the prior owner. Now Arnie is possessed by that. And if you notice, and I was kind of paying attention through this watch, if you notice the way the clothing that Arnie wears is not typical of somebody from 1978. He's got the leather vest on, which is very reminiscent of the, kind of mid 60s, really rough and stuff like that. But in the latter part, where I would say that he's full on rebel, he has a rebel without a cause, James Dean kind of outfit. And the only thing that's different is that he's wearing a black turtleneck, and I think Dean has a white one, but he's got the red jacket and, the dark pants and things like that. So that is actually an interesting progression through the book. And I think Carpenter does a nice nod to it without having to really do a lot of explaining. So I think the adaptation that he presents here is pretty good as far as dealing with that without getting down in the weeds.
I was going to ask you, Michelle, do you remember a moment in the book when the ghost, I think it's LeBay that they reference, if he's ever mentioned to sit next to Arnie in the car or kind of sit in the same place as Arnie to kind of, show that maybe he's possessed him, either literally, spiritually, emotionally?
All I can remember is it was mostly coming down to language and kind of the way that he held himself.
I was watching an interview, I think it was a behind the scenes making of Christine, and they were talking to Bill Phillips, one of the screenwriters. One of the challenges when you are doing a screenplay based off of a novel is the first thing I do is go in to see what can get cut, because, certainly with King, he writes a lot. So it's how do you pare down and what can you remove while still keeping the heart of the story? And he mentioned, I guess there were a bunch of scenes where there was that spirit either in the back seat kind of talking and having a dialogue with Arnie maybe. And he's we just remove this and just keep it about the car. They wanted to make it about the car, not necessarily the spirit. And I think that was a good choice. Sounds like it was a good choice.
Definitely really feel that Arnie is obsessed with the car. The car brings him something that nobody else is able to bring to his life. I don't know about anybody else, but I thought the death scene of Arnie when, he's thrown through the hood and he reaches out to try to touch the grill and maybe he just barely touches it. Really quite well done.
Do folks have favorite moments or sequences that they really responded to in this?
Aside from the car being on fire is a cool visual. I think the dialogue that we've been having here is one of my favorite parts of Christine, is the idea of possession versus agency. After Christine builds herself, the next scene, I think his name's Moochie or something. He was walking around and Christine is hunting him down. Mm-hmm. I thought it was Christine and Arnie together. Okay, Arnie is not out there killing his bullies. Christine is. Is Christine doing it on Arnie's behalf because Arnie's been picked on, or is Christine doing it as revenge because these guys took a turn on her? But then I'm like, okay, that's a weird mix-up. It kind of leaves Arnie out of it because he's kind of oblivious to it. His bullies are dying. He's getting questioned by Harry Dean Stanton. He's like, he's being all cocky about it, but he's still not part of that. Now, what gets really weird is the final sequence, the showdown, is Christine shows up and overtly Arnie is in there, and overtly he is driving the car trying to run over his significant other. Right. So the question is that Christine, she being jealous against and my apologies, I forgot her name. Or is that Arnie acting on his own agency? Maybe a little bit of Christine peppered in there. That that's Arnie. It's 100% Arnie until Arnie dies and Christine is back on her own. And to me, that's kind of, I want to say, messed up, because that's the full metamorphosis on Arnie. That with or without Christine, this was perhaps who he was always meant to be, will become, and Christine was just a catalyst to get it out. Ambiguous to, okay, Arnie's not involved, to Arnie is complicit and maybe he is the one overtly doing everything. Adds to this, is it possession or free will / agency? And I think that's the big toss up in the air about this movie, which I actually dig.
I think he's all in.
Oh, they're in the wavelength right there for sure.
Yeah.
And I think also in that scene, if you look at it again, Christine being a sentient being, the car could have repaired itself at any time. Clearly, like it had that ability.
Absolutely, yeah.
To Arnie, I'm showing you. This is, again, like it's like this dysfunctional, really horrible relationship. But there's something like really dark about that, and that it waited until that moment they're alone together, and it's like, I'm revealing myself to you, like that. It's really fucked up.
It's great. It's super dark. It's my favorite scene.
Okay, show me.
It's erotic in its own way. And it's like a simple special effect. It's a classic special effect, but it's so effective. And it is creepy. I feel like it's a real marquee moment in this movie. And like, you're saying, Nick, like Christine on Fire is like gorgeous. There's a lot of great stuff in here. Like, and when she's in the car and Christine is kind of like, removing her air, starting to like kill her, like, and the way they use the lights, there's a lot of like really artful stuff in here, and it's unique. It's like, okay, yeah, a car can run you over, but what else do we got? And I think the fun of this movie is that there's a lot more bag of tricks. There is a bag of tricks here that's being rolled out, and it's really entertaining.
Well, Josh, when you say artful, the two things I think of that Christine has that would be echoed in later movies is, we're talking about Christine as a wrecked car, Arnie in front of it, and it's kind of erotic, everything. That's a little Cronenberg, J.G. Ballard Crash going on there. Overall, with the kind of throwback to 1950s, but in the present day, there is very much a Blue Velvet Lynchian thing going on in this film as well.
I got to give credit too to Keith Gordon, who everything you guys are talking about, the eroticism, the actor who played Arnie, I was reading, he purposely did that. Every time he was touching Christine, he was trying to touch it like with like if he was touching a woman. And I think that meet cute thing you said earlier, Pete, I think maybe that was something that as an actor, he honed in on and said, this is the other person I'm acting against. This is the significant other that balances me out. A dark relationship, sure. But I think to your question earlier, Josh, like maybe not necessarily a scene that I loved, but thinking of relationships that counterbalances Lee and Dennis and how they legit care about their friend. And I know one of the deleted scenes is them getting together at like a burger joint and they kiss. And they realize that they have a chemistry as well. And that's not in the final cut. that's probably to the movie's, the theatrical cut's benefit, because it just kind of, I think, further highlights the fact that they are his friends. And yes, maybe they live on the same block or they've been friends since kindergarten. It doesn't matter. They may, one may be a nerd, one may be a jock. They're still friends. And I think that's something interesting, that even though you have the toxic relationship, you also have a legit friendship. We are worried about our friend. We know that all this stuff is happening, whether they buy into the supernatural aspects or not. They certainly buy into something's going on with the car, but they know something's wrong with their friend and they want to help them.
That's the great thing about the show don't tell aspect of their friendship, because I don't think it needs to be spelled out like why. Because of course you look at it and be like, well, this guy has no friends, and here's like the captain of the football team. Like it doesn't make sense. But those things happen. They happen in real life. He doesn't need a reason to be his friend, but it kind of establishes him as just being a genuinely good person, that he has legitimate fondness for this guy, and they are good friends. And I like that it's kind of unspoken. You don't have to delve into like the reasons why like these two disparate people have found each other. Like it just is. And you go with it because the performances are really strong, and that the movie doesn't work without, certainly Keith Gordon really taking it from one extreme to the next. But like, everyone's doing like really good work in this.
Yeah, there's a version of this movie that like you're saying, Pete, it's like if there was a different actor in that role on both sides, maybe we wouldn't buy it. What's great about that performance and the writing, you totally buy it. And like I don't remember ever watching this movie and being like, gosh, that's weird. I think there's something on the part, certainly from the source material, but like in the writing and the directing and the performances, this matters to all the filmmakers. This movie could be 100% more exploitive, but it's not. It chooses to retain all of those important metaphors about growing up, and it chooses to retain some of the strength of this movie is about these relationships being strained. Like it could be a slasher movie. There's a version of this movie that is that nerdy guy and his killer car. That's it. And it comes out in the 80s, and it's got an exploitive cover, and people dig it, right? And it's like they kind of went this other direction.
In that alternate version, Josh, Scott Baio would have been cast to play Arnie because he had auditioned for it. You would have had Kevin Bacon as Dennis, but instead he does Footloose. You have Nicolas Cage, who auditioned for the role of Buddy, and I think that honestly would have probably worked just fine. Harry Dean Stanton would have probably just been played by Dick Miller in that alternate universe.
That's hilarious. That's a whole other podcast. Is there alternate universe 80s movies? That's all.
Bernie, did you see? I think the studio wanted Brooke Shields as Lee as well. I remember.
I did see that. Yeah, and I think that
coming off of Blue Lagoon or something. I think at the time.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to John Carpenter's credit in wanting to cast unknowns, probably knowing that on the production side, they're already making the movie before the book is out. Book is out April of 1983. Movie comes out in December, I believe it was, later in the year, I think. But movie production takes some time. The fact that King has already sold this, good for him. That Carpenter has moved on from Firestarter, which was in production, to this. So there's a lot of inertia that's happening to make this movie quickly for a property that's hot after, King had already done Salem's Lot, The Shining, Carrie prior to this. So he's a known commodity. People like his books. Carrie, I bet, was probably a bestseller in 1983. But then having the vision in Kobritz, who produced this, who I had
Kobritz, right?
When I saw this, I'm like, oh yeah, isn't the woman that is watching Adriana Barbeau? That's
oh, come on, Mrs. Kobritz.
That's right. There you go.
Yeah, Mrs. Kobritz.
It's like for a lesser quote unquote Carpenter, for more of a modern day embraced cult classic. They sure made a lot of good decisions back then that seemed to be thoughtful. And then in making those casting choices, people that didn't have that maybe cinematic or TV baggage, where he's like, no, like you got to believe that this kid is a bit of an outcast, but that his friend is legitimately his friend. Bad things will happen to them. And you have to care about these people just like his friends do.
And Richard Kobritz, I think, also to tie in another string, was he either produced or was heavily involved in the Salem's Lot miniseries. So there's that another King connection that moved forward.
Absolutely.
And Barry Bernardi and Larry Franco are on here too. And I think Larry Franco is like Carpenter's like brother-in-law, or Kurt Russell's brother-in-law. Like they're all connected. Like it's all in the family. And the other thing that's like, there's an editor also who worked on this, Marion Rothman, who also would go on to do memoirs and would do Starman as well. So it's interesting because it's this other family group who kind of followed Carpenter on this transition, before we got to some where he was going back into the independent stuff. It's really firing in all cylinders, this movie.
Oh boy. I've got some trivia I want to just throw out.
I hope this trivia is thorough good.
Oh, wow.
I'll try to do it as best as I can here. I'll try to be in my top gear. 15%.
Oh my God.
To the Bad to the Bone song that plays.
Yes.
They're all coming fast and furious here, Nick.
Yeah, maybe like a Plymouth Fury there, Josh. 15% of the budget was just on the cars. They used like 28 cars, and 2 were destroyed. Portions of the film, Arnie's Neighborhood specifically, were shot in South Pasadena, which I think, if I'm not mistaken,
Halloween?
they kind of use, for Halloween. And like a lot of that, like you need to have that Midwest look, so you shoot in Pasadena. Christine's license plate starts with CGB, which is an acronym for Close Quarters Battle. And it's funny, when I read that, I was like, okay, that's kind of cool, interesting. But again, I think it goes back to something that we've all kind of talked about, and how like it nods to an era from maybe like the 50s, and maybe how this car culture begins with veterans coming back from World War II, and in the same ways that they're looking for freedom and highways, and the cars represents that and gives them access to this. The car represents more than maybe it does for us now, because it wasn't as easy to get as it was, as it is now, as it was then. So I'm wondering if there was some sort of nod there to World War II with Close Quarters Battle. I'm sure if someone's listening and they are more of a fan of World War II and can maybe connect those dots, please let us know. Stephen King dot I did want to connect. The car has a cameo in Cat's Eye. It also has the bumper sticker that says, a little on the nose, quote, "Watch out for me, I'm pure evil, I am Christine." So
nice.
So gotta love that, if to your point, Josh, if it's all in the family with Carpenter, it's all in the family with King as well.
Heck yeah.
One of my only real little gripes with the movie is that there's a lot of fleeing in the middle of the road.
Yes.
It's an odd choice. It's an odd choice, but
I always wonder about that stuff, Pete, because there's this tradition, I think, of like in most chase sequences in movies in general, where it's like if they just jog left or right, the movie would be over. And like but it seems like this is like a ubiquitous thing. There's no chase if they don't make a left. I think when the Beatles were talking about why don't we do it in the road, they were talking about why don't we run away from people in the middle of the road? Let's do this.
I think when it boils down to it, it just makes for such a cool shot. You got that low angle, you got the headlights on the road, you got the person like running. It's just like, well, you got to use the shot. So just keep running.
Just keep running.
Tonight on the CBS Saturday movie, Christine.
Next on CBS.
Because I hate that car.
The Shining was only a haunting horror. Carrie was only flesh and blood. But when Stephen King created Christine, he built her to last. Don't touch her. And don't get in her way. Stephen King and John Carpenter combine their talents at terror. You don't drive her. She drives you. Christine.
Oh, Bernie, I know we're going to conclude here in a few, but I do want to toss out kind of a philosophical question about Christine. What is Christine? It's so profound, but, this movie has 2 villains. Arnie has a villain story. Christine does not have a villain story. She just exists. She's never like struck by lightning or a magic spell cast on her. She just rolls off the assembly line already evil. And then, as like Pete was saying earlier, she could rebuild herself at any time. Like when she's sitting in the backyard, in rust and everything, she could have rebuilt herself at any time, but she didn't. And Arnie comes, replaces like all her parts, which is this weird like Ship-a-Theseus thing going on here of, how much of that car is really Christine? How much is
still there, right?
What really is a Christine? The car as a whole, a ghost inside that we never saw there? Is it just a ambiguous concept that's just manifested as a car? What is a Christine?
A great question.
I will say that from the book, Arnie says, I think he's pretty candid with Dennis maybe at some point where he says, I actually don't remember ever fixing Christine. And that's alluded to, I think, a little bit in the movie where I think he there's like a one little comment, well, I don't remember all this, or, that kind of thing. But in the book, he definitely, I think that she's kind of fixing herself a little bit. Let's look back at the fact that at the start of the movie, he says, I'm taking shop. My parents don't understand why I'm taking shop. But it sounds like the first time he's taking auto shop. So how could he possibly repair
how could he do that?
A car that is completely totaled like she is at the beginning? So it doesn't completely answer your question, Nick, but it does allude to the fact that I think that a lot of her parts were always there and is part of what is Christine.
And I think the short answer is that she's the catalyst, right, for Arnie's journey.
Oh, yeah.
But I think the truth is there's a Christine in all of us.
Oh,
there's a little Christine in each and every one of us. Merry Christmas.
I mean, I think you could argue that Christine could be viewed as a misunderstood entity. I mean, Arnie is the first person that shows her the proper love and care, and maybe I'm using they are emotionally stunted, and then it can't deal with anyone else giving him any affection or showing him the time of day, and so she lashes out, and they lash out. I mean, I don't know if I even buy that, but I think that's an argument that could be made if you want to really delve deep into what is Christine. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. And the Christine is all the dead friends we made along the way.
And then we ran over when they were in the middle of the street.
In the middle of the street. That's it, Bert.